Okay, so hi everyone. Today we have Ricard from Barcelona give a talk on the deep seminar. He has made so many significant contributions to the field of the complex system, and his research is very broad. So, which is our pleasure today to have him share his insight about the living system. But after his talk, if you have time, you can come to talk to him and discuss about many other things. So thank you for coming and okay. Okay, and this is the lead started.
All right. So thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be in a place where complex systems is at the center. And so my talk is not going to be highly technical. It's more like presenting an idea that comes from a paper that we recently. What's going on? I think I want to move.
You first have to click the OK.
Oh man. Okay.
I don't think this is the best.
What is this? Okay. Should work, I guess. So what is the okay there? Yeah, still.
Yeah, this one.
But what is my cursor? I don't see it.
I don't see. Maybe you have to do okay.
No. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, sorry. So this is an overview of a kind of a roadmap into questions related to the fundamental constraints that might, in a way, shape the possible lives that we can find here and elsewhere. And a lot about what I'm going to talk is about what can be predicted. And of course, this is very much at the center of how we build theories, or to what extent we can actually build a theory that, starting from given knowledge, allows us to make predictions. I put Laplace demon here because I'm going to present four demons. Laplace is a very much well-known kind of character related to the power of prediction from physics, right? It was thought by Pierre-Simon de Laplace, saying that since Newtonian physics is so powerful, if I could determine the position and velocity of every single particle in the universe, nothing in the future will be a mystery. I could predict everything that's going to happen. And also the past will be totally available, right? So it's a super deterministic picture. Of course, this idea has been challenged within complex systems. The idea that there are emergent phenomena and that a knowledge of the fundamental parts of a system does not necessarily mean that we are going to understand the system, right? Something that when I was a student was really far away from this picture. I studied physics and biology, and in biology, everyone said, you know the genes, you know everything. And in physics, you know the particles, you know everything, because everything is a special case of that, right? Which is absolutely wrong. And even in physics, I just put these papers here that I would like to mention. More is different by Anderson is one of the building blocks of this idea that even in physics, where you think that things should come out from a very reductionist picture, from particles to everything, even in physics, this is something that is challenged. And I like this paper by David Pines, one of the founders of the Santa Fe Institute, and very interesting character, by the way. This is a PNA's paper, The Theory of Everything. It's kind of a sarcasm, because it actually brings the idea that, again, even in physics, starting from multiple body Hamiltonian, in principle, you could actually derive a lot of things, right? But as you know, when you say in principle, usually means that it's not going to happen, right? So this is the paper that was published late last year. In a way, it captures a lot of what I've been doing in my entire career for 30 years in complex systems. And it makes a very strong point, which I'm going to try to defend here, which is that if you go for life somewhere else, if you want to build life in the lab, right? There are extremely fundamental constraints on what is possible, right? So, in other ways, in terms of the logic, and that's an important point, and that's one of the challenges we have, because the logic means that you have to have they're using physics, but also computation, information theory, and other stuff. And, I've been working on that for many years. And 2 years ago, I had the idea that it was in Santa Fe, and there was a bunch of really interesting and smart people. So I decided that it was a good idea to put them together, like here, and present that and make the paper together, right? So if you think that sometime, think twice. The paper contains a lot of stuff. I can even giving the basic ideas. It's not possible to go into everything in an hour, but I strongly recommend it. There are things I'm not going to go through, but you can discuss afterward, like the thermodynamics, development, which in itself is a huge story. There were things we wanted to include, like language, because language is really interesting. It has universals also. But at that point, the paper was already 50% larger than should be allowed. So in order to avoid the editor to have a heart attack, we didn't put it. So the paper starts with this idea. Imagine that a space-proof lands in a distant planet. Why do we choose that? Because one legitimate question we have to ask ourselves is that, how do you identify life? How do you know that you observe something that is a living system, right? And of course, there's a lot of opinions for that, but it's a very interesting time now, because it's this whole field of astrobiology where people is trying to go into identifying fundamental principles that could, in a way, tells us something about what to expect, right? It's very likely that maybe in the next decade, thanks to the new proofs that are going to be used to map exoplanets, it might happen that with some point we point somewhere in the sky and say, there is a planet that has life, right? So we are looking for the biosignatures, etc. But then is the other side of the coin, which is now we have all this potential for bioengineering living systems. And one legitimate question also is, what are the limits for bioengineering? Can we engineer anything beyond the logic of standard life, right? Our lab has a wet lab, synthetic biology. We've been theoreticians for many years, but 12 years ago, we had the chance of building a wet lab. Everybody was kind of like, well, the theoreticians are having a lab, but anyway, it works. So there are many questions that are related to what I'm going to talk about that this has a long history, particularly regarding to the problem of how innovations happen in evolution, right? Because this is really something that's still to be solved in many cases. So how the major innovations happen, how the first cells, the first multicellular systems, population, sex, language, everything, right? We have natural selection, which is extremely powerful theory, and we use that all the time for many things. But the nature of innovations, that's something that can be very tricky, right? So how did it happen? And there's several ways of attacking the problem, of course. And there are side questions behind that. Like, for example, one thing that I think that physicists will understand well is the idea that can be ordered for free, that there are some kind of fundamental laws that in a way constrain the potential of the possible, right? Some things are forbidden, but also there are kind of inevitable structures that come from dynamical patterns. I put this here marked, the fundamental limits of synthetic biological designs, because we, in particular in my lab, we're using synthetic biology, which is kind of, the last part of the genetic engineering, to interrogate complexity. Most people use synthetic biology for biomedical research, for a number of things that can be done. But we use that to actually test things. For example, if I cannot build in the lab some kind of system, right, that is not observed in nature, is it because evolution is unable to get there? Or it is because it's essentially forbidden for any reason? So some years ago, that's kind of a precursor of what I'm going to to say, I organized this working group at the Santa Fe Institute that ended up with this very nice theme issue in philosophical transactions called the major synthetic evolutionary transitions, meaning that, of course, we cannot go back in time to see how language emerged or how life emerged. But now we are at a very interesting time where, along with artificial life models, evolutionary robotics, we have also synthetic biology. So it's the potential for recapitulating things or trying to build transitions in the lab, right? Plus the power of statistical physics, which is the possibility of finding universals based on that. And in this particular issue, I have my own contribution, which is this paper, where what I try to make the point is that a natural language for understanding major evolutionary transitions is phase transitions, right? Because for many reasons, there's a very good mapping between the different qualitative phenomena that happen across the transition points, right? And the universalities. And there I try to put together phase transitions in different models from chirality to language, right? A lot of stuff to be done. But anyways, so what else is important here for what I'm going to say? A very important part of the debate that we have within evolutionary biology and complexity is the nature of evolution itself. So to what extent evolution is historical, so it is very path dependent, right? So every event might matter, or not, or that fundamental constraints might actually limit what is possible in that. The very well-known metaphor for that is Steve Gould's idea that he put in this book, Wonderful Life. Very nice book. It triggered a lot of controversy. And he essentially goes into this problem of 550 million years ago, there was this explosion in creativity where essentially all animal designs emerged in the biosphere from a very simple kind of multicellular filtering creatures into something that involves all kinds of things, right? Predators in particular, that change everything. In that fauna that you find in the fossils, there are a number of organisms that they put here and there, some of which survive in terms of giving rise into what we have here. Some of them didn't. And he points that maybe if some survive and not others, the biosphere will be totally different, all right? So it's a good point. And he uses the title Wonderful Life because this is movie. Let me see if it's here. Yeah, you probably have seen it. You know, I watch it every Christmas, so I can see it lots of times, where it has this character that, to make the long story short, he's a very good guy, but at some point he feels like his life has been a waste, and he says, maybe the world will be better if I haven't been born, right? So there's an angel, which is a very annoying character, who goes there and says, well, no, you don't have to kill yourself. So I'll give you an opportunity to see how the world will be if you were having been born. And of course, the world without him is much worse, right? He didn't save his brother when he was a kid from a frozen lake, so his brother couldn't save a bunch of soldiers in the war, etc., and everything is terrible. So Gould makes the point that if you rerun the tape of evolution, right, from the Cambrian explosion, for example, or previous the Cambrian, we will see a biosphere that will be essentially alien, totally different story, right? So contingency is kind of dominating, but there's the other side of the coin, which is, I think it's very well expressed in this book, Life Solution. Sounds like a self-help book, but it's a book about evolutionary convergence, right? Here, my demon, right, Waddington's demon, will be a creature that, using genes, gene networks, etc., will be able to infer organs, organisms, tissues, the complexity on the largest scale. Is that possible, right? For many reasons, we know it's not. But there's been several people Ricard was a big figure in this. My mentor, Brian Goodwin, that they were kind of insisting over the years that there are higher level laws related to development, which are probably limited by what self-organization can create, what kind of patterning phenomena can be possible, right? And convergence, meaning what? Convergence is something that we observe in natural systems, very widespread, which means that the same solution to a given problem emerges again and again, multiple times in independent ways in evolution, right? Our eye, for example, this camera eye with the crystalline and retina, et cetera, has been invented maybe 25 times. And you can find it from us to the octopus, right? Which is a totally different branch from here, to even single cell organisms, believe it or not, that have an eye inside made by endosymbiotic bacteria. So the point here is that it is interesting to see, sorry.
So if I understand the structure is correctly, these demons basically relate with microscopic information with how predictable.
Yeah. Yeah.
What exactly is this demon representing?
So Waddington is, this demon is in the same place. The box here is like, what are the theories you can have or the generative rules that will allow, that's the question, is it possible or not, to go from the microscopic information, so to speak, so molecular interactions, genes, and gene-gene interactions, right, into something that has to do with a large-scale architecture of organisms that
fixed by the.
Yeah. We know that the mapping is totally nonlinear, right?
Yeah.
So it's not at all immediate, right?
Even if we add the environmental conditions inside the lab, I mean, you know about the environment where this part will be.
That's an extra thing that you have to have, right? But for example, in development is a mechanism that is robust enough to be kind of insensitive to external perturbations. We know that, right?
So by a theory, we need something like a finite set of rules, how from this get that.
Yes, yeah. Yep. Okay, and final demon is kind of satanic talk, right? This Kaufman, Stuart Kaufman, also my mentor in Santa Fe, he makes this point that I think has a lot of interesting sides here. And from here is where it starts, trying to argue against him. He's a very good friend, so but we argue all the time. He makes the point that evolution, to a large extent, comes from combinatorics, from reusing things, right, on multiple scales. Has been very successful, such. But he makes the point that because combinatorics implies a huge potential space of possibilities, given an initial conditions where you have a number of objects, say abstraction, right? You can combine the adjacent possible. The next layer of what you can build is essentially unpredictable, right? That's a very, very simplified way of saying it, but this is the idea. So he kind of argues that it's not possible to make kind of a formal theory of evolution in terms of physics, right? So, so what is possible and what is not? Okay, in a way, it's something that encapsulates what I'm going to explain. As a science fiction fan, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff that has been proposed by different authors about ways in which life could be orthogonal to what we know. Okay, well, and I put this sentence by Feynman because we all like to put Feynman stuff, right? Imagination of nature is far, far greater than the imagination of man. Is that so? Well, I'm trying to convince you that maybe not. And how can we approach the problem of what's possible in life and whether or not there are fundamental laws, right? So there's the universals in physics. There's the powerful potential that we can use simple models to actually find out universals. There's stuff in information theory. I'm not going to touch much of that today. What artificial life models can bring. Artificial life is a field where people can do a lot of crazy things, like evolving stuff, sometimes ignoring completely conservation laws, for example. So it's a field where in principle you could get into very, very, very different stuff at the end, right? Trying to show you that this is not the case. And then constraints from synthetic biology. And one particular thing in the paper you will find out, and I like to bring it here, is the vision of some people, right? People that ahead of molecular biology, ahead of discoveries that were made decades later, infer what would be this kind of fundamental laws, right? So let's go for different parts of the story. So again, this is very kind of compressed thing. Every single example I'm going to give you, it's something that is a proposal for a research, right? Because what I'm going to do is conjectures, not mathematical conjectures, but some of them we are working on, and I hope it stimulates debate. One important thing, life, it contains molecular polymers, right? At a very fundamental level, it's totally universal everywhere, of course, universal in our planet, right? You could say what happens somewhere else, right? So one important thing we discovered in the 50s is that the molecules responsible for heredity, are these nice nucleic acids, is that it's two precursors of people who actually kind of foresee that, right? One, which is the one that everybody cites, right, in his little book, What is Life? It's a quite a modest title. Schrodinger makes the point that whatever it is, at that time, where proteins or nucleic acids were the potential possibilities, he said whatever it is has to be a disordered crystal, right? Which means that it has to be some internal organization, some regularity, right? But has to be able to contain something that allows information to get stored, right? Okay, that's a nice intuition, right? I didn't know about this guy, Nikolai Koltsov. Has anyone heard? All right, that's a disaster, really, because, I mean, of course, he wrote in Russian, which didn't help. But Koltsov in 1927, so pretty much ahead Schrodinger, he was investigating about the chromatin within cells. He was kind of trying to figure out how heredity works, right? And at some point, he writes that heredity has to be based in giant linear molecules that have complementary behavior, right? And that replicate it in a semi-conservative way, which is exactly what DNA does, right? The insight is amazing. I mean, hats off, right? Unfortunately, Koltsov was in Russia, Stalin Russia, and as many others was kind of wiped out by Stalin. But another interesting thing to say, sorry.
So I have no idea. Were there around that period sort of thousands of scientists speculating about different structures and they happened to get it right? Or was actually were not so many people talking about it and they just immediately nailed it?
No, exactly. In fact, there's if you look at the historical records, there's people that speculate in a very vague ways, not trying to have a mechanistic description. So Schrodinger in a way, but especially also goes into a mechanistic to what to expect exactly about complementarity. This is something that is just the double helix, right? Semi-conservative replication. That's the way DNA replicates. So he stumbled into the solution, right? So if I ask you, tell me the simplest way you can think of a molecular system that stores information that can be read. That's an important point, right? Of course, we are biased because we know, right? We know if you are in computer science, it's a Turing machine, right? A tape and a machine that reads. Interestingly, in biology, we have essentially the same thing, right? Long tapes, different levels, right? And machines that read that, okay? So you could say, well, maybe there's other ways of doing that, okay? But I want to make the point that they are not, okay? We have a genetic code, which has some particular properties and combinatorics that I'm not going to go to that. But the thing is that it's interesting that the formulation that you can make of a very abstract way of looking at computation kind of matches what we see inside cells. I'm thinking in cells and everything I want to talk about, about origins, right? How the first things happen. Of course, you can look at cells, and there's a lot of unfolding of information on the surfaces and everything else, right? But at the fundamental level, you have that. So a couple of things to say. One is, what's the importance of having linear polymers, right? And there's something I want to point out, because this is early work in theoretical biology by Howard Patti and others, but especially him. Something about the nature of the revolution that represents, that in a way goes beyond physics, right? Because once you have long polymers, not so long polymers, you have a combinatorial space, right? If the polymers allow for a diverse range of units, you immediately have something totally new, right? Which is not captured by chemistry, it's not captured by physics, it's captured by the potential for evolution, right? So there's something that is revolutionary there. And I want to point out, without going into details, is that you have this landscape of possibilities in the polymer space for a given environment, etc. If you use different polymers, you know, natural selection can start to create complexity, right? And the more we know about that, the more clear it is that these landscapes, this is a paper by Susana Manrubia, which I very much recommend. These landscapes contain, like for free, immediate possibilities for evolving, right? It's not difficult to find out solutions that push evolution forward. And of course, you can say, well, linear polymer, but maybe there's alternatives, right? Well, one thing that is very important I want to point out is, I said storing information and reading it, right? That's very important, because I can think in molecules that are heterogeneous, and I could say, well, there's a Shannon information value of that, and I can say this information, but if you cannot read, that's totally useless, right? It's like tree rings, right? You got the tree, you see the rings, and I can read information. The tree is unable to, right? It's not information available to the organism. So you can think anyways in terms of, what if I have a two-dimensional substrate, not a string, right? Well, I can tell you that it's plenty of problems, right? If you want to read the information, right, you need a much more complex machinery for actually doing this in a reliable way. The possibilities for, for failure, for not error correcting is huge. With two of my colleagues with the SFI, Chris Kempis and David Warper, we're trying to make now a theory for thermodynamic costs of all that, right? And seems to clearly point out that linear polymers is the solution. There's been attempts to go into two dimensions, but again, you can build two-dimensional nucleotide kind of lattices. And what do you do with that, right? How do you actually read the heterogeneity that you have there? So the first conjecture we made is that molecular information, if you want storage and processing, requires necessarily linear polymers.
So old computers use these rotating hard disks. They were two-dimensional surfaces. Guaranteed. Why did they work then? Because they secretly are one-dimensional spun around.
You mean which computers are you?
So you have these hard disks that have these metal disks that were spinning around. This little arm that reads the information.
Yeah.
But it was a two-dimensional surface that carried the information.
Well, is that so?
Or is it secretly a one-dimensional line?
I think
you have to read in one dimension, nevertheless, right?
Okay. I have no idea how that works.
Okay, but
It was always one dimension.
Yeah.
Okay.
let's not forget that anyways, we're talking about how biology can build that, right? So that will be the first conjecture, which opens a number of sub-questions. Everything here opens several questions that have regarding physics and computation and et cetera, et cetera. Second thing, one of the universal things we see in life, right, everywhere in the planet is cells. Cells are really the fundamental units of life, and they are either free or belong to an organism, okay? But is there any escape from that? Can we go somewhere else and find out something that is not that unit of life? Well, there's again another precursor of someone who thought about that several years ahead, molecular biology. It was von Neumann. Von Neumann, at the end of his life, which unfortunately ended up because he was thinking in brains and life. So who knows what if he and Alan Turing didn't die so soon? Who knows how the landscape will be now in complex systems, right? So he was interested in the problem of what are the conditions in which a machine can replicate itself. It's an important question for many reasons. Of course, he was a mathematician. He didn't have a reason for kind of looking for any kind of theory. But it's a legitimate question. On the one hand, machines are very different from living systems in many respects, right? One of them is that living systems replicate themselves, right? So can you actually formulate kind of a general theory of that? If you dig into the theory, there's a precursor that I mentioned here. This paper is very nice. There's this paper, I don't know if you know, the Kleen's second recursion theorem. Is a very, very obscure paper, I must say, which in a way, if you dig around, you can extract the idea that a Turing machine can replicate it, make a copy of itself, right? Make another Turing machine. That would be kind of the nice way of summarizing this. Anyways, von Neumann was going beyond that, kind of the open-ended evolution. But the interesting thing is that he ended up with an idea, which is the machine that is able to replicate itself should contain a set of instructions. The instructions should guide the process of replication, but they have to be copied with the machine in the end. And that's exactly what ribosomes do for cells, right? And DNA plays the role of software, so giving the information for driving the things to happen, but it's also hardware that has to be copied, right? That's exactly the dual nature of information. And he mentioned, well, there has to be a duplicator and a controller and a constructor. So if you ask a biologist, what is this? We'll say, oh, this is a cell, right? You have a duplicator, which is the polymerases that copy the information, and so on and so forth, right? Not bad because it's pretty much ahead of anything we knew about the logic of life, right? And particularly of cells. So one of the things that this brings is maybe the logic of cells, cellular dynamics, the cell as a unit, maybe it's universal. Maybe it's, von Neumann found that because this is actually the only possibility. There are many things around that are relevant for building a theory of what I was just saying, whether or not the units of life are at this. One is that life works with soft matter, and that means that a lot of this machinery that we talk about in a very engineering way can actually be part of a self-organizing principle, right? If you base life, like membranes, for example, with lipids, it's a piece of soft matter. We know with soft matter we have different phases and phase transitions. So you can actually exploit that. You don't have actually to have exactly what von Neumann suggests. I skipped this. It's just a lot of things that have to be solved. In particular, having a thermodynamic theory of the life cycle, which we still don't have. So our conjecture is the basic units of life should be essentially, in terms of the logic, again, the logic is the important thing, right? For Neumann machines. All right, let me jump. Cognition, right? It's a lot of things that can be said here. It's an interesting time now that we have artificial life kind of in the forefront.
The first constraint that was unidimensional molecular structures. What's the parameter here? Is like the von Neumann architecture for self-replicating machines?
Is the von Neumann architecture
Sort of cybernetic structure?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's not like a physical embedded, it's more abstract structure.
Yes.
Compartments and.
Yes, I don't want to go into the details, but the mention I made about soft matter and everything is that the side of the problem that we have to figure out for biology, where you have soft matter, is so the hardware.
That advanced distribution and disease.
Yeah.
But it should map into some sort of open system thermodynamical description of what is generatively possible to embed that architecture, and that will be the expected constraint. Right?
Yeah, but the logic will be von Neumann's.
Yes. So what kind of open thermodynamical system can implement von Neumann replicative architecture?
Yes. Yeah. So cognition means a lot of things. That's one of the research areas that we have in my group, trying to figure out the cognition space. This is a paper of Hochfeld. I must say, I was so happy when he got the Nobel Prize, right? One of my students sent me a WhatsApp saying, Hochfeld just got the Nobel Prize. But of course, I thought it was a prank. It wasn't. So he has this paper that nobody seems to know about a very important question regarding the nature of computation and how it connects with life. And he makes the point that one fundamental thing that distinguishes living from non-living systems, if you want biology from physics, is the presence of computation in a very broad sense, right? Meaning that you have agents that gather information from an environment and respond to that environment, making a computation, right, in adaptive ways. So there's plenty of possibilities, again, if you're thinking what's possible and what's not, plenty of possibilities that we do not observe, right? Which is one of my, as you can see, one of my obsessions. And also, just want to point that I organized another workshop at the Santa Fe Institute with two of my colleagues regarding this idea, regarding the idea of what is cognition and how do we map the different kinds of cognition we observe in nature, right? Which is not only the brains we know, but also all kinds of alternative things, from insect colonies to the immune system. So, if any of you is interested, I mean, I'm giving a talk in the afternoon about this, right? And this funny thing called science and cocktails. I don't know how this is going to end up, but anyway. So one particular point that I want to make, because this is in the paper, it regards the architecture of the fundamental units of systems performing computations, right? Neural systems, which is the fact that we have a common basic unit, the neurons, right? This amazing architecture. I also point to my students, when you look at different cell types, you could sometimes infer what the cell is doing, right? Maybe it contains big vesicles because it secretes that. The neuron has this tree architecture. Why is that? Because it's searching for connections, right? Searching for information. So this is a pretty universal thing. And neurons, making the story very simplified, essentially are polar units, right? They propagate information in one direction, and they are threshold elements, right? So they require a threshold of activation coming from many different neurons that have to make the input, make a decision of firing or not. So, for those of you who are in neuroscience, you know that this is a simplified picture. It's the macula pits picture, right? Which again, they use something that was very powerful because it's very simple, but allows to infer a number of really interesting things. So why is that? Why neurons are polar and threshold elements? Is there alternatives to that? Another point I want to make, when you look at genetic regulatory networks, the standard models that we use, right, essentially are neural network-like, because again, you have also, despite the apparent differences, you have promoter sites where several genes, the gene products can put there and interact, inhibiting and activating. And the models that we use, right, essentially are in the same class. And something similar happens with immune networks. So how is that? Why is that there? Yes.
Just a question. I don't want to spoil your title, but this is a Wilson-Cowan model, right? So how from this Wilson-Cowan model, you have a fluid dynamic. Do you do some post-training?
But you mean the Wilson-Cowan for
cortical
dynamics?
DTI, DT, this is Wilson-Cowan, right? And I see just the title of your talk, the science cocktail liquid brain. So we see that the brain you can be considered as a fluid dynamic.
That's again a liquid system, right? Because the internal dynamics is happening in a. I'm not going to go into that. But is a fluid system, right? But you don't have these fixed connections that happens within neural networks, right? I don't know if I get your question, because this is just the standard.
This is the standard Wilson-Cowan, but if you want to have dynamic synaptics, you put a plastic CT. You put some learning to change the synapses.
We don't put it here.
Okay.
Typically, right? Because it's hardwired
Yeah.
The weights have been evolved.
And the way the weight has been involved, you more the weight as a fluid.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, I got.
Okay. So the problem is not just limited to the units, because from the units, what can be built, right? And it's interesting that within the brain cortex, we know this is multi-layer architecture, which actually inspired the first people who built the first neural networks, right? Perceptrons, multi-layer perceptrons, etc. But you could actually say, of course, ChatGPT and everything goes into this direction. But you could ask, well, would it be possible a biosphere where you don't have this kind of units propagating in one dimension with thresholds, right? Something else could happen. Well, it's interesting to see that people, again, working in artificial life, you could evolve anything, right? Imagine you want to evolve a network that gathers information and processes to give a given functionality. Why you will have that, right? And what those are things we are working in my lab. And the idea is, imagine that I evolve a circuit, a network of cells that initially just fire in any kind of way, right? But have to execute certain functionality. So I allow the system to evolve the way in which units interact and propagate information. Guess what? What we get in the end is threshold elements which are polar, right? It seems to be an escapable solution. One thing I wanted to point out is that it has a lot of side parts, right? This is a paper I worked with one of my former students, Luis Seoane, on suggesting that if you want to build general artificial intelligence and all that stuff, you might probably have inevitably to go into the roads that follow our brain architecture, right? Have to go into steps, which include the embodiment, for example, right? Having a body. We propose this space of the possible. And in that space, which is one of my ways of approaching some problems, we put several kind of try to be orthogonal axes, like to what extent interactions between agents are important, the computational complexity, which is a tricky thing, right? How do you measure exactly that? So this is a qualitative space, right? And the degree of autonomy. So how likely are you to manage yourself in an autonomous way in a given diverse environment? And we try to organize here everything. These spaces are interesting for two reasons, just to point out. One is that they are usually include empty voids, right? Where parts of the space where there's nothing. And which are very important because they point out into constraints, things that are probably not available to evolution, okay? And there's plenty of things to discuss about this, right? Some people argue that you put the human here like the most complex. Well, that's what I think. It's the most complex one. And a lot of things that are around. And anyways, two conjectures that emerge from what we present is that cognitive agents require threshold-like polar units. This is a universal thing. You have to have in mind that, for example, for octopus, is the completely separated branch from vertebrates that emerge, right? And where we get in the end neurons, multi-layer cortex, etc., right? And a consequence of that is that the way in which you can use these polar elements to actually perform computations seems to be in a way constrained in creating multi-layers, right? So what we find out in biology may be part of the inevitable story. Okay, in the paper you will find out there's a section on development, right? Which I think is very interesting, but I still need to figure out how to explain this is in a compressed way, so I skip it and jump into ecosystems. It might sound strange that I talk about ecosystems because ecosystems are a very, very diverse thing. Sounds like something that is so diverse that maybe no universals here, right? Okay. You'll see. First thing to say, when an ecologist go into the field, part of my career has been theoretical ecology, so I think I know what I'm talking about. You can categorize with no much problem. So what's the kind of qualitative class that every single organism belongs to? in terms of ecological interactions, right? Competitors and predators and parasites, symbionts, etc., etc. So this is a discrete collection possibilities, right? A legitimate question is why this and not something else, yeah? And also, even if you go into the paleobiology, it's possible to infer networks of interactions and say pretty much a lot about what the fossils were doing, right? And the more we know, the more clear is that we can actually establish that. So is there a visionary here? Someone who actually kind of foresee this kind of potential universals in ecology? If there's one guy, Niels Barricelli, you can find a very interesting description. This is a book I recommend very much. Two books, actually. Darwin Among the Machines and Turing's Cathedral by George Dyson. He makes a historical record of the development of computation and computers. Barricelli was obsessed with the problem of evolution of complexity and symbiogenesis, particularly. And he had the idea, why not to model that in a computer? So a simulation of living ecosystems was, you know, the first computers were built, and von Neumann was very interested in that idea. So eventually was managing to go there to Princeton and to Los Alamos and to use the computers at night because he was the crazy guy, not simulating atomic bombs, but simulating living things. And he found that a way of figuring out, of making kind of these models that were happening in a one-dimensional universe and kind of put there the basic elements of interactions, mutations, etc. So two things happened. One is that he found out something that's going to be important in our discussion is parasites fuck up everything. So one of the immediate things that typically happen is that you have viruses. You have kind of parasites that exploit others and make collapse the system. So he had to control that. So he was God, the God of the electronic computer. So he put control. If you pull down parasites, you do have the emergence of cooperative structures in this one-dimensional universe, right? And so there was this kind of embryo of symbiogenesis. Almost everybody forgot about Barricelli, but then in the late 80s and early 90s, there was the rise of artificial life from Chris Langton and colleagues. And it was this particular work that you'll find, I think you'll find amazing, by Tom Ray. Tom Ray, he's a real ecologist, right? So not suspicious of anything. He works in Costa Rica, and he was very much interested in the problem of how ecological complexity emerges. And a very legitimate question, which is, why is the biosphere so complex? Why is not a planet just filled of bacteria? Right? What anything else? So he did something that now is kind of mainstream, but at the time was pretty unique. With his laptop, he figured out to make very simple code, so programs in machine code that would be kind of strings, say genomes. These programs originally were totally identical. You put them in the computer, they compete for the memory, right? There's no real biology. And you add something which is mutations, right? When you copy yourself, you copy on top of another one, so you conserve the number of objects. You can make a mistake, right? This is a simplified way of saying everything, but the thing that happened was the following. He didn't expect much to happen. The first thing that happened was he found out, because you can observe everything, there were programs that replicate faster. So mutants replicate faster. Why was that? Because they were shorter. The smaller you are, the faster you replicate. Okay, that makes sense. Then some others appear, right, that replicate also fast. And then when he checked the code, he found out that these programs were unable to copy by themselves. They used the code of others, right? So we were parasites. Then hyperparasites emerge. The parasites are the parasites, things that we pretty much observe in nature. Then something else emerged. How do you escape from parasites? And one way of escaping from parasites is, since parasites tend to detect some regularity in you, okay, could be phenotypic or genotypic. Why about scrambling code, right? in a funny way, you can say this is sex, right? You recombine things, so you make new pieces of programs that parasites cannot recognize. And at the end, you also found out that there were groups of programs that none of which was pretty much efficient, but they cooperated with each other, right? So the group was more efficient in replicating, right? Well, I mean, if you're not impressed, I'm not going to say anything that impresses you. It's quite amazing because this is far away from real life, right? Apparently. But it turns out that because the logic of what is required, copying, mutating, and acting in a universe where you compete with others, several major steps that we see in real evolution emerge, right? And so you identify the logic of life. And that, in a way, is one of the answers to the conjecture that Steve Gould made. What happens if you rerun the tape of evolution, right? Is there something that you cannot recognize that is totally different rules, totally different behaviors? It's not, right? There's plenty of things that have been done in recent years. We also have been working on that because one thing that seems to be very, very interesting and important is embodiment. That if you evolve in ecosystems within an embodied physical environment that can feedback where your ecological rules, a lot of things happen, right? And this can be formalized in a number of ways. Walter Fontana was one of the people who actually formalized that using lambda calculus and mappings into random reaction networks. And again, one of the interesting things that happens is that parasites are inevitable, well, all the time. So we suggested in the paper actually that instead of standard phylogenetic networks of species, one thing you can look at, and it's our way of saying that ecosystems also will have these strong regularities, and we classify in discrete classes, is that you can make a tree starting from whatever it is, and aggregating different kinds of organisms, of agents, whether they are competitors, they are parasites, they are whatever. And that you will expect always to have a very thick branch here that is going to interact with others, because parasites, we know they are an engine of evolution. So you have parasites, and that forces the system into escaping into new directions. So it's a machinery for novelty. So several people have tried to provide explanations of why parasites. It seems so obvious, right? Parasites are everywhere, right? From cells to multicellular systems, from politics. So how do you actually explain this universality?
With parasites, we could also symbiotic behaviors.
Well, symbiosis will be kind of the opposite, right? Because you cooperate.
Yeah.
Parasites exploit whoever is there, the pocket that is there for you, just for you, right? So the legitimate question is, okay, parasites seem to be a universal thing. Make a theory of that, right? What would be the way of formulating a theory? Should be possible, right? And almost there. Sorry. So the conjecture. Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry. I went very quick. Sorry. So the possible organization of ecological networks in terms of different layers, the classes like predators, prey, symbionts, you cannot escape from that, from this logic. Right? It's a finite range of possibilities. And I went very quickly. I mean, go to the paper because there's a lot of stuff there. And kind of one of the sides of this that appears to be very obvious is parasites, the presence of parasites.
I'm a little surprised that the conjecture is not change.
What do you mean inevitable? I mean, what?
Or maybe change is a fundamental aspect.
Well, it is. I mean, actually, I'm going to go into the last part of the mechanism. Right? But I mean, to get into complexity, you have to evolve. You have to change. Right? Yeah. Plus, there's in the ecological context, there's the Red Queen story, right? That you have to change all the time. But nevertheless, you preserve ecological structure, right? Okay. So a very important question. Sorry,
The parasites like are universal, does mean that we will never defeat all diseases and cancer.
No, I mean, we have defeated diseases.
All diseases,
All.
not single ones,
Well, I mean,
because they are also like parasites in this context.
well, so, for example, cancer is in a way, sometimes it's been presented as a parasite, right? That emerges inside you and breaks cooperation, which is essentially what cancer is, right? Breaks the rule of you do not have Darwinian evolution inside you. So if you become a cancer cell, it means that you're free ride for finding ways of just growing, right? At the cost of the host. But it doesn't propagate, except for one kind of cancer.
I don't know.
Cancer?
Yeah.
There's one case study for Tasmanian, what's called the Tasmanian wolf, which propagates by saliva. It's very peculiar and it's fascinating. It's a whole area within evolutionary biology, in fact. And you could make a question of why cancer does not propagate more often.
If a parasite can emerge, then even if we defeat all of them, then for cancer, and then we dissolve new ones can emerge.
Yeah.
And what it says is below, if it falls, it's inevitable that something like that will happen over and over.
Well, you can talk about that later if you want, because this is an open, it's a Pandora's box. It's a lot of things inside that.
Spread in vivo is also coming faster inside the individual, so it's a problem spreading too.
Yeah, which is the first time that it was found out that cancer can come from genetic origins. Yeah. It's not a common thing. Most cancers are just intrinsic. All right. So is natural selection the law of evolution? Think about what the origins of the talk. We are another planet, could be a biosphere where life emerges not based on natural selection, right? And in the paper, we speculate about that, again, going back into the phase transition story, because Manfred Eigen himself kind of suggested the idea that natural selection in a way goes into phase transitions, either jumping the system, crossing boundaries. But there's been a lot of work, not a lot of work in terms of kind of thinking seriously about origins of life. The problem of, was natural selection acting right from the beginning? I don't think this is reasonable. There's also the possibility of thinking of alternative biospheres. For example, I could think in a biosphere where you have structures that emerge, macromolecular structure by self-organization, and the whole thing is to maintain themselves. Imagine that you have a robust way of not replicating, but just keeping alive in a way, maintaining out of equilibrium. I can think about that. There's been people in synthetic biology that has built protocells that do not replicate, right? Which actually is one of the challenges. And that you could say, well, they are alive because they exchange matter and energy, they are out of equilibrium. This is something that can be, one, possible in terms of generating complexity, and second, can this allow complexity to emerge? Because self-sustaining is not much into the future, right? So I have almost finished. This is one of the questions that we try to formulate, whether we can actually think, probably using physics again, ways into rethink the way we consider how evolution happens, right? I like this sentence by Leonard Susskind in one of his books, The Cosmic Landscape. It's about physics and the history of the universe, which in a way you can think is an evolutionary experiment. Right? We make the point that modern cosmology really begins with Darwin and Wallace kind of saying they are very fundamental generative mechanisms for evolving complexity that go beyond biology. Right? So our conjecture, which we try to defend, and we are working on that also, is that natural selection is very likely to be the way in which we propel complexity, right? Because we force the system going into transition. Self-sustaining is something that might allow complexity to, maybe at the beginning to be there, but not very powerful. And we think that information, of course, has to be central, and you need the replicators. So you could say, what a disappointment, right? Because, sorry.
It's the natural selection on what?
Okay, good question. I mean, it's a good point, because I mean, natural selection can actually act on multiple scales and actually across scales, right? It could happen. Some people has argued that things that happen in the physical world that had to do with, I don't know, the different ways into which things sediment, for example. But in a way you could say, well, there's a kind of selection process. But if you don't have replicators, right, all these processes of self-organization just end up into something. There's no possibility for open-ended evolution, which is something I haven't addressed, right? But it's kind of the big issues about the dynamics, the potential for creating more and more innovations, right? So natural selection, in my opinion, will act on replicators. So you need first to have that, for sure. So it's no surprise, right? But if the logic of life is universal, and I'm saying that it's going to be around the same, I go to another planet and I have linear polymers and cells, right? So it's no space for surprise. And actually, you could say, imagine that these organisms haven't emerged in our planet, right? Which could have happened, right? If we knew that this would be possible in someone else, well, look, this is an alien, right? This is really, really, really different. It is in a number of ways, right? Octopi is one of my favorite creatures, right? Because they're quite smart, really. You know, I'm sure you have heard all kinds of stories about them. Like, you know, some of them escaped from in the institute that is side by side of when I'm working. They also have found out they have these cameras, and some octopi at the night just escapes from the fish tank, goes somewhere else, because visiting friends, and he's back. Well, why are you back? Right? Well, unfortunately, they just live kind of 2 years, so the potential for developing more complexity is very limited for the biology. But I want to point out, yes, I haven't addressed the fact that phenotypic plasticity is huge. Even in any single group of organisms you can analyze in this biosphere, you'll find out that the potential for making shapes is amazingly large, right? But again, I'm going into the logic. The logic. If you look at this animal, the eyes are pretty much the same as ours, invented in totally different, independent way. You look at the brain, right? And you find out neurons, right? Neurons that we know. Unless you're familiar, you'll say, okay, maybe I'm seeing the brain cortex of a vertebrate, the section, because it's multi-layers. And a lot of the organizational behavior is the same, right? And actually the repertoire of behavior, or learning, memory, association, etc., we share it totally, right? Again, so the idea is the logic is the same, okay? And this is a paper that I recommend because it's a very nice way of showing that the mapping between the vertebrate brain and the octopi brain might seem so different in principle for the trajectories. It's pretty good, right? And we end the paper actually saying that if the proposed constraints are universal, the logic of life elsewhere should be familiar, right? That's the big point. Having in mind that every single thing I said needs to be made real, making a theory, right? We're working on some of the points, and I'll be glad, of course, to collaborate with anyone who is interested in exploring this. And well, and this has been done, as I was saying, it's been fun to do this work because in a way, for me, it's a synthesis of many open questions I've been stumbling over the years. And it's been fun because this is my first group, the Computer System Lab. Young people, no money, everybody saying, why are you doing complex systems, right? Why don't you do serious physics? And interesting to say that when you reanalyze what kind of things were we discussing at that time, many of these open problems have been just percolating and shaping until now. It's still open, right? And I think that's all. Yes, thank you.
But there are universal laws for biology, so whatever life will emerge is the same somehow. Then the same things you say will happen for cognition. For organisms they get complex enough, more or less.
Yes.
This means that also any knowledge in the universe for any animal which also be universal, I will produce knowledge.
Well, that's a very strong claim.
But if
It goes
mechanism for producing knowledge it has universal features, then the knowledge itself from whatever source will also have universal features.
Well, it's more speculative, Marina. One thing that I skipped today is language, for example. That in language you also have these we could say emerging statistics like Zipf's law and the architecture of word interaction networks that seem to pervade complexity across languages, right? To get into the language structure, you need to go into error threshold and error correcting thresholds. There's a number of things that I also think make complex communication fit into some particular law, right, of organization, which I'm not saying it explains, for example, syntax, because we haven't solved that, right? But I think also, and as much as, and I'm speculating, right, as much as language architecture in the way it's recursive is relevant for building thought, etc. Yeah, I will say that it will constrain what can be generated.
I'm asking because there is like folklore conjectures in mathematical folklore for at least going for 200 years that thinking has universal heuristics. And of every dozen some years, some mathematician will write a book about it. And most likely the first important person was like Poincaré or something. And it just repeats, and today there are many heuristical conjectures, philosophy of mathematics, exactly about the fact that how we produce it is universal, even beyond mathematics.
Yeah, this is not part of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know, right? Okay. I don't want to be so far. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in kind of the limits of this proposal, but that's a tricky thing. Answering that means, I mean, I think everything I suggested here in terms of the logic can be proof or disproven, right? Can be actually made. Imagine just a dream, right? That you can make a model from statistical physics of potential landscape of polymers carrying information. Imagine that this is possible and that there's a phase that is robust and kind of generic that you can identify with the way in which biological polymers work, right? I could make the argument that this is kind of a proof that the universal character of that. For what you're saying, you have to go into other stuff, right? And when you go into cognition, you have all the cultural story for humans, because we are talking about humans, right? So it's plenty of things that it's not captured here.
David Deutsch has tried to connect these two, where he says, offers epistemology and science is kind of like the Darwinian revolution. And that's contrasted to Lamarckian evolution, which corresponds to inductive epistemology. So he tries to connect these two in an explicit way. I think that would be.
I would like to have your work a little bit on the concept of teleology, because teleology of this kind of is it like is the tree already see? Is there any destiny for, because you're like these logic constraints of like different levels, if we know them all at times, then we have nothing to you know, it's sort of like God given, you know, evolutionary trajectory. So how close is your argument to be picked up by teleological arguments? One, that's the first question.
Okay.
The second question is that I feel very strong traces, because it's like if you have a formal system and you start with some actions, then you can build certain truths. Then you can change the axiomatic system and you can eventually replicate the same truth. So there's something called descriptive complexity in logic that allows you to say, okay, certain kinds of structures lead to the certain limits of what you can say. And then if you extend the structure, yeah, you get to natural numbers or something like that, and then you get incompleteness theorems, and this can be emerging in many different setups. So, what is an alternative axiomatic system? Because we have physics as a basic axiomatic system, and what would be the alternative? And I was thinking that maybe that alternative is if we are always talking about macroscopic physics here, so we are not involved in quantum behavior, like non-local. I think, for example, the reading thing, the unidimensional thing that you were saying, is implicitly assuming that we have to have local interactions between the entities so information can be read. So of course, in a three-dimensional space by default, one dimension will be like the simplest way to do it. But if you abandon the locality assumption for interaction, then I don't think it looks like trivial that one dimensional is the way to go. There are basically no dimensions anymore. So then, I wonder if you have explored the concept of like, it sounds so bad to say that quantum life, you know, like how all this logic of living of life can be reconstructed using like quantum phenomena. Like
Okay.
interference with patterns, you know, because reading you can do with interference as well. Interference doesn't mean necessarily local.
Okay.
So this is the second question.
If you say more things, I'm
And I
going
have
to
one
forget
more.
about the previous.
Great talk.
Thank
you.
you.
From Brussels with him. He comes from the Philippines, and he's visiting Brussels, and we came just to see what.
Okay, thank you. I'm flattered. Well, about teleology, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's clearly evolution is a way of building complexity in the universe. So you want to achieve really complex structures, you need life. And one of the sides that emerges from this talk, I haven't said, but means that because these things are connected, you need linear polymers to have information that can be used within cells, etc. There's actually an implicit narrative that you can make that if you go somewhere else, right, you will have to have, if life has evolved, then you will identify the kind of the steps of complexity emerging following this kind of logic constraints, right? So I want to emphasize that we are ignoring pretty much, looking at the logic, all the phenotypic diversity. And I'm not including here, because it's a very long story in every single site you can take, that in other places, let's say in other planets, because of constraints related with gravity, with available resources, sometimes for special elements that are necessary, life might be just not emergent or can stagnate into something simple, right? Life in our life has stagnated for a very long time before oxygen was enough abundant. So there's a number of environmental issues here. I'm not kind of considering. Concerning the other.
If the environment has sufficient complexity, then it kind of, and then you need to have a logic for environment. That's it. What are the features that you have to support this transition?
That
doesn't really change the argument.
This is the field of exoplanet research, right?
Yeah.
That, I mean, if I was a student now and you ask me what you want to do, I will go into that because there's so many interesting stuff going on. But one of the things that people wants to figure out is not only the conditions for habitability, having water and things like that, because we assume that water is necessary, but also starting to think in evolution. What evolution allows to do. You need a planet where life regulates the planet's climate, which might be the case, right? And well, I have something to say, but it's a spoiler of the talk in the afternoon, which is a fun thing, and I'm not going to do it. Well, just wanted to mention I'm an extremely big skeptic about the quantum story. The reason of that is, one thing is polymers are easy to generate in chemistry. A derivation of that, I didn't mention, but it's very important, is that for a linear polymer, right? I mean, hydrocarbon molecules, which are extremely boring, it's a polymer, easy to generate, but this is exactly the same thing over and over again. So if you want to make a linear polymer, means that I need units that bind with two neighbors, right? With similar energies, so I can have a heterogeneity and store information. Who are the candidates for that, right? Amino acids, that's not so cool because this tends of folding. Nucleic acids, right? Nucleotides. So one of the implications of our claims is that this old idea that 20 years ago I wouldn't have liked it much, that DNA may be something that you find out somewhere else. Maybe it's not as absurd as it might be, right? And on the quantum, I'm a strong skeptic. I mean, quantum mechanics has been useful for understanding photosynthesis, and understanding meaning at the physics level. And it's beautiful, it's great. But for example, it has nothing to say in neuroscience. I mean, it has been proven very well. That Max Tegmark has a paper on that, on saying at the synaptic level, at the basic molecular level, is huge decoherence. I mean, there's no way in which quantum mechanics can be extrapolated into higher levels. And I mean, from the chemistry, you have a lot of for free of order that comes from linearity, as I was saying. Linearity, because if I have to read a molecule in particular, one dimension, so you have, I'm extremely constrained. If I'm a machine that reads that, I can go in this direction or this direction. So it's very easy to actually put order there and logic.
But it's like trying to look with the same filter reality. Like, you have to expect that you are asking whether there are alternatives, not whether everything else or something else can do exactly what this thing does. So it's another, you have to define what it's to read. For example, what is to read? It's having a unidimensional structure that has to be read. If that is what it means to read, then of course you're not probably going to find too many options because the definition is too constrained to what you're looking for. But I think read is not looking at a unidimensional structure. It's like extracting certain patterns, which you said, extracting patterns.
Yeah. I have no objection. I have no objection about that.
And then the question is a little bit more like nuanced then.
But not really, because I mean, you can say, well, if you look at gene networks, for example, the way in which you can define information happens in a different stance than a linear polymer, right? It unfolds in different ways. Yes, but let's go back into emergence of life, right? So what is there that is really available chemically in the reasonable circumstances? And linear polymers is one of the things.
Yes.
Right? Clearly. So that's why
not denying the possibility of an alternative. It's like in science, you know, the typical kind of false. If you have something that is a falsation of the thing, then the thing is not valid anymore as a universe.
Yeah. But again, it is precisely the idea that every single thing that is being claimed here, I'm conscious that we don't have proofs, yet,
Yeah.
right? But if it can be formalized, and that's why I hope that physics can help here,
Yeah.
because physics can establish real universals that you have no way to escape from, right? If that's possible, then we can really say strong things about universal logic.
Yeah. So
I have a very different question.
Okay.
There were a couple of things that I saw amazing talk.
Thank you.
Did as well. There were a couple of things that were not in the talk, and I was just curious because maybe you just assume them as logic. So
Oh, yeah, maybe not.
like instability was not as part of a characteristic, which I and diversity. These were two things that I did not see, and I was just curious, is that because you kind of assume those already, or maybe you didn't get to it, or
No, yeah.
And I had, related to that, you said, what is forbidden? I was also curious whether there was a role for unsustainable instances of a species or whatever, and mistakes. That's also a key part of that.
Okay, let me see if I can get into all that. I mean, the paper, of course, takes, again, because the paper was becoming too morose and it was trying to get into a book, right?
Yeah.
And we have to cut and choose. Dynamics is extremely important, for sure, and stability. And it went very quickly when it was mentioned the cells, but to have cells that can be agents in natural selection, they have to replicate themselves. And for that, this is a particular important instantiation because it's very easy to get closed vesicles because the physics allows that to happen, minimum energy. But to make these closed vesicles, which are very important because they define inside, outside, they define the agent. So it's kind of a physics of agency. That's a precursor of life. You need to grow and destabilize.
I mean,
Right?
instability.
Instability is part of the story. Okay? It is a requirement. As it is, if you think in multicellular systems, right? In contrast to machines, there's this constant conflict between regenerating structures and removing part of it, right? We are a clear example every single day. Millions and millions of cells decide to kill themselves, right? It's part of the story. And the tension actually is what makes us so different from machines and kind of the explanatory origin of most diseases, right?
Yeah.
Right, when you bring the stability. And what was you asking me about?
And diversity, so the relationship between instability and diversity, that's why I was just curious if that was a part of it.
Well, the diversity is here implicitly of this in several instances in the landscape of the combinatorial landscape, right? Because this allows diversity of potential solutions that can be explored. And as I was saying, this is something that goes beyond the standard physics picture. It's not like have a property that is energy or efficiency. It's the landscape. It's the combinatorial potential. Yes. Yeah. And then in ecology, of course, is the diversity of life in terms of ecological complexity. So in a way, we kind of say, well, this is there, right? We try to say, if this is there, and if I make a matrix of interactions and I classify things, whether they have positive or negative interaction, is a discrete system, right? This is all the possibilities. And I guess one of the lessons we have from our planet, which is our n=1 statistics, right, is that, again, diversity from molecular diversity to phenotypic diversity, I could think in huge different ways, in science fiction, right, in which biology could be organized by across scales from the microbiomes to the Amazonian rainforest. The logic of ecological interactions is the same, right? It's no outliers. And again, that's why I was presenting the artificial life example. In the totally artificial world, where there's no real energy sources and metabolism, it means many things are just ignored. Evolutionary dynamics drives you into essentially the same solutions, right?
So I was thinking about this list of properties or constraints you mentioned, in terms of whether they are sufficient or necessary. These two, and if you phrase them like limits or constraints, they sound like necessary conditions, which seems to imply that there might be systems that obey all these rules that are not living. Have you come with that at all?
Not
Or are they
really.
necessary and sufficient?
Simulation.
Not really. Well, I mean, there's the discussion of whether simulated life is life or not.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on how you want to define it. Actually, one of the interesting things that has come about these and the follow-up has to do with the way in which we try to define things. Let me make a parenthesis that regards different questions. There's a question that's been floating around since, I don't know, all times, which is what is life, right? I've been in several discussions about that, not necessarily in a bar after drinking a lot, but this is ongoing, right? How do you define life? And I think we stumble into the way of looking at that in a different perspective, which I think even epistemology is interesting. And actually, it's been recently, Michael Levin he made the mistake of sending an email to 40 people saying, how do you define life? Because I want to make a paper, and he thought that people will consistently answer that in a kind of coherent way. So let's skip a number of nonsense there. But the interesting thing is that the answers of that is not one definition. It's actually several ways in which you will organize what is life in a space of the possible, right? So in a space of the possible, where you put computational complexity, the complexity of metabolism, the complexity of information, which essentially kind of captures there, life covers a chunk of this space, and it's not there in another part. So for me, this is maybe a different way of rethinking questions in biology that are not so easy to address like in physics, right? Which is the structure of the landscape is the answer, right? Life is that part of the space that is covered by these potential solutions, right? And that is something that allows to actually put the artificial life systems that replicate in the computer, right? To anything that is coming out recently, which is, artificial intelligence systems and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I see it now as, okay, you can choose different bases in this space of structures. And they might be necessary or sufficient, or neither, or both.
Yeah, I think the one part of the story that we brought here, I will think about the logic, is that the necessary conditions, right, for actually building. Because on top of that, you can have all this phenotypic plasticity and the adaptation to a given environment, right? Plus all kinds of things that have to do, as I mentioned before, with stagnation. Because in another planet, it might happen that life develops until, with a kind of maximum level of complexity, because resources are scarce or that's another open problem.
Nice talk.
Thanks.
But I see you move more towards a logic explanation of evolution. Would you find a reconciliation with the old school physics, like a
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk about the logic because I think we can make a good point of looking at the right universals, right? Because as soon as you move into something that goes into a landscape where, for example, I was going into this talk recently about a guy, totally different topic, studying bats in some place in the world. and he analyzed the diversity of shapes of the head, of the cranium. Diversity goes from bats, which have a very elongated kind of nose, to those which were completely flat. So phenotypic plasticity in terms of development and organismal complexity is huge. But of course, they share a number of, again, behaviors, logic, brain architecture, etc. There's no way in which you can diverge in this direction. So physics, yes, anything that we formulated here, I think, can be driven into the direction of physics. For example, the polymers. I was saying before that one of the projects we have with a couple of colleagues at SFI is the thermodynamic cost of having a genetic code that is based not in 3 unit codons or to have more amino acids, etc. So is the thing how do we observe the only solution? Because the thermodynamic cost is minimum, right? And I think it is. But this connects with thermodynamics. And for other things that we have, although apparently might not seem, right? But for example, the units of life, the cells. I think that is a pretty good way of kind of showing that self-replicating units that are encapsulated, right? Our solution is a phase in a space of possibilities within the physics of soft matter, right? That forms vesicles, etc. It's possible to at least I couldn't say to prove, right? But at least to formulate in terms of physics. And in general, I think most of the things that we present here, in a way or another, my hope is that it is a statistical physics approach, very much informed with biology, right? Because sometimes some physicists kind of tend to take biology as something that I can read a paper and that's I know, and that's not the case, right? At all. And so it's I will say that if not all, most of them, ideally maybe end up in a Hamiltonian or something like that. But I do think physics is the way. Yeah. Physics, but again, computation had to be part of the story. But physics and computation, it's go together pretty well. So yeah. But again, I want to emphasize every single piece of what I'm showing, plus the things I haven't shown about thermodynamics and development or language. These are a roadmap because I think there's the open questions are really powerful, very important, and address something that is fundamental. And I was the same in the next years, as astrobiology develops, it's important to know about things, what to expect.
Maybe in the other direction, okay, that's I'm not expert in this, but I'm going to ask, but as far as I know, there are extensions of Boolean logic that would be across all the types of phenomena. Do you see that you could also use more general logic than Boolean logic for evolution?
For example, extensions like
quantum logic, but not quantum mechanics, but like to compass quantum measurements, there's new logic of quantum logic just to include consistent measurements and these kind of things, but it's in research in logic, you would create a new logic that's like a more abstract than Boolean expression. Do you see any failure in the logic that you use that could benefit from more general types of logic?
I haven't really thought about that.
The sense of the word logic we were told is not the formal sense of formal logic.
Not necessarily.
It's more like pattern.
Let's say the generative rules, the most fundamental thing that allows complexity to be defined, right? What?
The grammar.
Well, almost there. Yeah.
Something like that, like the structural grammar or something.
Yeah. Oh, question.
So complexity is always in a state of flux. So could it be that the grammar of the logic is also constantly or down the line it could be also changing, and then there's no set defined for defining complexity later on, it's also evolving.
Depends on what you mean by that. Some of the things I have mentioned, you have to have in mind that biology, for example, if polymers get established at some point, that's the way in which information is going to be carried out afterwards, that's pretty much a frozen accident. That's not going to change, right? So despite you can, on top of that, you can put more things, and for example, develop grammars in a very broad sense. You have to have in mind that the nature of biology, which is self-replication and invasion of everything when possible, makes that to be a frozen accident. I mention also this because there's been these conjectures by Paul Davies and other people like saying that maybe in our own planet there's other lives. So he says the shadow life, right? That maybe I don't think this is not only possible, but I think that is pretty much forbidden by ecology. I mean, if there was another alternative life living around, you still need to exploit resources, and you always make a signature of that, right? And as soon as DNA was kind of the winner here, it invaded the planet. And on top of that, I mean, you can create all kinds of generative rules, and for example, grammar is important because on top of polymers, when you put the polymers there as a kind of the first block, and you access the combinatorial space, then there's how this connects with you being a replicator and a competitor, and if you're part of a cell, there's a lot of closures that emerge there. And it's another layer that goes a little bit beyond this. Right? I don't know if I answered this question.
Yes, but I was also thinking maybe we're saying it's frozen because we're constraining this time scale, but if we're extending the time scale, we might be frozen.
But I mean, if you go, I mean, if evolution keeps going, yeah, but again, I mean, there are many things that have emerged that is just fixed in terms of logic units, for example, cells. And there's a lot of regularities that's shown by convergence, right? That again, you could expect a totally different solution. I mean, we are humans, we engineer things, we can build things that biology can even figure out, right? But within the evolutionary course, most of the things that we see have been repeated again and again multiple times, and essentially are the same, from eyes to behavior, right? And behavior, we have a number of rules which are discrete also that define the building blocks of behavior. And what else is there? And again, artificial life systems could generate things and patterns that could say, okay, this is not learning or conditioning or whatever. We don't find that.
So about evolution, so I think what always wonders me is that some of the things like evolution survive, but only seems to have happened once. We seem to have very exceptional conditions that we have to go apart. The cell and sometimes the information carrier, molecules combined with each other. And also things which happened in the Cambrian, but all only seem to have occurred once. So don't you think that evolution is also subjected to very special environmental conditions?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe this will never happen again. Also not all the time.
Yeah, that's why there's two things in the paper. One is that we protect ourselves from this, talking about the logic, right? Because this is pretty much universal and does not depend much on, for example, extinction events that have changed a lot of things. And on the other hand, what the last sentence here is that, in fact, that there's all this potential diversity that comes out on top of the logic, right? If you look at specificities within cells, there's a lot of accidents there, right? There's no denial of that. I mean, clearly, I think it's reasonable to think that unless the meteorite hit the Earth 65 million years ago, mammals who have had a hard time, right? Because dinosaurs were dominating ecosystems all over the place, right? So yeah. I mean, in no way we are saying there's no space for accident, but the end sentence that the biosphere could be different, but clearly familiar. That's the point, right? That because there's this fundamental layer of organization across scales about the logic. You will say, I'm a field ecologist, and in this different biosphere, I can see this is a predator, this is a prey, this is parasites. If I look at organisms, I will find out fundamental units, right? Closed systems, because the membrane is an amazing jump into creating an agent, and is a requirement, right? We have been working on that. I mean, it's not just I'm claiming things, right? Because in soft matter, you have closed vesicles, but you have plenty of things. You have foams and all kinds of things. Could life be based on that? So that's one of the things we're working on, right? To what extent living systems that can be, catalytic cycles on foams, for example, that can also generate diversity, structural diversity. But it is something that can propagate as an agent and then be under natural selection in a really, really powerful way. So it has to be done. But I think there are steps, and again, it's the physics, right? So understanding the properties of what brings out of equilibrium physics into living stuff. That's the way.
Follow up on this question, like if you think about all possible configuration spaces to margin, that as a father and super your talk, you can make some constraints that you make some sort of dimensionality reduction, and in that space, you see life, and they will have the same ingredients, just you see different spirit or whatever. Yeah. So if I would like to make these constraints, where should I look towards for that constraint? Like,
so constraints you put in the system.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the constraints that will come from physics, essentially, right? About the costs, thermodynamic costs. I think that is kind of the key thing. But again, for example, the example that I mentioned of a protocell cycle, thermodynamic thing. It's amazing that we still don't have the theory. We worked for several years on that. Is less trivial than we thought. I mean, we can make a physical model of a protocell based on polymers and physical space, and show that there's a broad range of conditions that it can destabilize, right? But we should be able to make this into a thermodynamic theory, right? That's a big challenge, surprisingly, but because it connects membrane stability with, have a membrane that is outside, inside, flows and gradients. When we started to work on that many years ago, we thought it should be doable, but it's 20 years ago, so it's should be doable.